Are you going to ask me questions?
Yeah, I'd like a question to start, just to get you going.
Oh, shit. I hope dogs don't bark and the chickens don't crow.
I was thinking about a question for you because I thought, I mean, I know quite a lot about you, but I wondered, do you ever feel like you've been treated differently because you're a woman? Perhaps in a job situation or just in everyday life?
Yes, and quite particularly recently in this last year, in this job that I'm doing, where it was like stepping back in time about maybe 40 years ago. The way that women are treated, or what is expected of women, or what is presumed of women. I was really quite startled about that. I thought, God, has feminism never occurred? So yes, it has happened. More so in that job than any other job I've had, which I think was, it came as such a shock, really.
So what was your response to that? Like, how did it sort of make you feel?
I'm angry. I feel really angry. I thought, this is ridiculous. I shouldn't still be having to have this battle just to do my job. And, we've had those battles. They should be accepted that they're over and done with, and we're not treated differently simply because you're a woman. So I mean, it's probably the nature of the area that I work in. But yeah, no, I was really angry and quite shocked. Yeah.
Something else I thought I was going to ask you about. And you've got, well, you're a grandmother, so you've got a daughter and a granddaughter now.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that your daughter, that her life is very different from you when you were a young woman? Do you think there's been a change, or do you think that women are still, struggling for the same kind of things between the generations?
I think overall the struggle is not so constant, but I do think there are some areas that things haven't changed, and sometimes, particularly with my granddaughter, I worry that we haven't gone backwards. I'm talking about things like body image and clothes and makeup, and my daughter doesn't feel comfortable even going to the supermarket or something if she hasn't got her face on. And her daughter is, I mean, it's an interesting mix because they're both really stroppy young women. One's obviously only 8, but they still have this.
It's sort of like the outer image, isn't it?
Yeah,
sort of that facade.
That's right. The facade is still important, whereas I suppose I've just given up, really. But, yeah.
But do you think you were the same when you were their age? Like, you probably were.
Yeah, probably. Although you see, when I was in my early 20s, that decade, from 20s to 30, that's probably when it was peak of feminism. So not wearing makeup or adorning your outer facade wasn't that cool. I mean, was cool rather than not cool. Wearing a lot of makeup wasn't cool, sort of thing. So I think in some ways, I think that was just part of the culture of that I grew up in, really. Where feminism was celebrated, whereas now I think it's not so much taken for granted, but I think women of my daughter's generation have, benefited from the battles that were fought, and their expectations to be treated no differently or disrespectfully because they're women.
So in a way, the sort of whole feminist movement has kind of disappeared for a lot of women, hasn't it? Like it's actually not at the forefront of a lot of
No, it's certainly
discussion
not.
anymore.
No, and well, that's interesting. I think it's just poking its head up again at the moment. But I do think for a lot of those women, there's just an assumption that their world will have a level of feminism in it anyway. You know, if you know what I mean, that they don't experience perhaps some of the more blatant sexism. I suspect the sort of less blatant and more underhand sexism still goes on, and again it depends on who you are, where you live, what you do for a job, all those sorts of things. I mean, the fact is, you know, women are still paid much less for doing than men, and that hasn't really changed, which really needs to be remembered, because in you know, that's a way of measuring equality, whether you're paid the same, and we're not. So overall,
Yeah, so there's a lot of, as you say, underhanded almost
yeah,
ways that women aren't treated equally.
yeah. I mean, it's the opposite of the overt, I suppose, isn't it? So, yeah.
Do you was there do you think there was a woman in your life that had were there any woman in your life that had a huge influence on you, and can you
Yes.
explain?
Yeah, well, as I said, I was lucky that that decade between 20 and 30 that would have been what years? The 70s to 80s, I suppose. And so there were a lot of really influential women writers and actresses and politicians, and I worked in the trade union movement, and that was, in some ways, the trade union movement was the bastion of sort of, you know, male sexist behaviour, but in other ways, because of the women coming up through it, and because of the sort of move of sort of middle class people into the union movement, feminism became a union issue and was brought to the fore. And so I think, you know, I can think of a number of women like Sonia Davies, other politicians that were around at the time, writers. I remember Broadsheet magazine that Renee started, and I used to write for that at one point. So I was sort of pretty much surrounded by a lot of strong women, and I was lucky. So, and yeah, I was carried along on that wave of feminism.
Was your mother a very strong woman? Is she a strong woman?
Yeah, she is a strong woman. She was a social worker. She's a hugely compassionate, empathetic person, but she doesn't put up with any form of discrimination at all. She's very non-judgmental about people, which means that she views people pretty much the same wherever they've come from or whatever they do. And so I think when she sees discrimination occurring because of someone's a woman or whatever their background or the job they do, then yeah, she gets pretty riled up about that. But yeah, she was a strong woman. Yeah.
So as a mother and a grandmother, and having been married and unmarried and
Married
and unmarried.
Yeah.
So what do you think? It's quite a difficult question, but you know, what do you think being a woman, especially, I guess I'm trying to get at the whole kind of the mother side, you know, being a mother and being a woman. What do you know, how do you view yourself in that role? I mean,
Well, I think that being a mother has been an absolutely defining thing for me. I mean, I was a young mother first time round, just turned 18, and then my second child was born when I was 30. But I was thinking about this the other day. I've made what some people would say were poor or bad career choices around, because of something that's going on with my children, you know, whether they're having children or they're not going through a good stage and they're not ready to leave home or whatever. There's several times where I've decided to either leave a job that I'm doing or not take up a job that I've been offered because whatever is going on for one or both of my children at the time is more important. And it sort of came to me the other day as a bit of a flash that actually this is not a bad thing, but I can't imagine any man actually either doing it or if they did, what's the word? Saying that they, admitting that they did.
Or being aware that that was an option for them. You know, that they wouldn't be aware that that's an option for them.
No, well in fact
that would be an
actually,
obvious option for their partner.
Yeah, and in a couple of instances I think for me that when I had to make those decisions about my career or my job situation was often actually because of decisions that they'd made about theirs that then negatively impacted me on whether I could still be a good mother. I know that's a very loaded statement, but be there for my children in the way that I thought I should be, and do the job or progress through that career path that I was on at the time. And it was actually quite helpful to realise that, when I've beaten myself up a bit in the past about why am I, doing the work I'm doing now, not doing something that's associated with what I trained for and went to university for and things like that. And then I think, well, actually, so what? The fact is that I made decisions about where I worked and what I was doing based around what my children's needs were at the time. And I think, why should I even be questioning myself or feeling guilty about that or thinking somehow that's wrong or that it's even a situation of conflict? It shouldn't be. And so I do think that going back to our earlier conversation about feminism nowadays, I still think that for women to have a career and raise children is bloody hard. It's harder for women than men. I'm sure there's some exceptions to that rule, but we're still expected to do both those jobs and do them well.
Yes, and a lot of sacrifice.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of pressure.
Level.
There's a lot of pressure on women. I remember when I had my son at age 30, and there was a sort of a reverse thing going on because I was able to, at that time, stay home with him, till he was... Shut up and go away.
Don't worry, they'll just edit it out.
Able to stay home with him. It was my choice to do that, but I can remember discussing it sort of with some other women who were in my sort of circle of friends at the time who had decided not to do that, mainly for career reasons rather than financial. But there was this weird sort of like swapping over of the guilt trips about it. Partly sometimes I felt guilty that I was staying home with my child and not going out and working and
taking up the opportunities.
Yeah, and then I think sometimes they felt guilty that they looked at me and thought, maybe we should be staying home with our children longer than 3 months or whatever. But the thing is, none of us should have felt guilty about anything. Those were choices that we made for ourselves as women. But having said that, yeah, I still think that there is this dual pressure on women to compete in the workforce, and I think that, compete's the right word, and to raise happy, healthy children that don't end up in prison or whatever, and I think that's tough. And of course there's a lot of women doing it on their own as well, raising the children.
Probably my final question is that I've interviewed a few people now, and there seems to be this kind of, for all the women I've spoken to, this kind of inner strength somehow that, follows people's stories all the way through. And I wonder, do you have an idea of, or an opinion on where that strength comes from for women?
God, sometimes I really doubt it. I'm not sure it's there, but I think it's just well, particularly when I've had dependent